First of all, I want to thank Loretta and the Congress committee for inviting me to speak at this Congress. I'm really impressed with all the work that went into this Congress and all the little gifts we have in our bags and everything. Yep. Thank you very much. I have to admit, when Loretta asked me to give a conference on joy in St. John of the Cross, I started to laugh. And I laughed and I laughed. I said, oh, that's great. Dark night, nada, mortification, terrible night, emptiness. And when I stopped laughing, I said, well, all right, I got to get to work, okay? I want to apologize also because I'm not very savvy with the internet, and so I don't have a PowerPoint, unfortunately. But anyway, I'll present my conference as best as I can. I said, Father Michael Joseph, how many of you know Father Michael Joseph? Well, he lives with me at Holy Hill. His major ministry is to help me with the computer, okay? He's just down there, a couple of doors away from me, so I'm always calling him. So I'm not very savvy in this area. Okay, the title of my lecture, of course, is Joy in the Life and Writings of St. John of the Cross. Joy is probably not the first word that comes to our mind when we think of John of the Cross. I recently asked some of the friars, what is the first word that comes to you when you think of St. John of the Cross? I was recently at our novitiate in Oregon, and some said, well, desire, love, which is very good. Others, dark night, detachment, mortification, nada, and of course, contemplation. Okay, very good. Assuredly, this lexicon looms large in John's mystical doctrine. And in preparation for my conference, I looked for the word alegría, joy, in the Spanish concordance of John's writings, and found many references to joy, and similar words, like synonyms like gozo, hermoso, fiesta, felicidad, in Spanish, joy, beauty, fiesta, a feast, and happiness. Joy may not be the first word that comes to us when we think of John, but without a doubt, joy is like an underground spring in his writings because John of the Cross was a man of one love, God, divine love, who is the source of true and lasting joy. In the living flame of love, John describes the joyful, festive spirit of the person who has arrived at mystical union, and I will quote, in this state of life so perfect, the soul always walks in festivity, inwardly and outwardly, and it frequently bears on its spiritual tongue a new song of great jubilation in God, a song always new, enfolded in a gladness and love, arising from the knowledge the soul has of its happy state. Sometimes it walks in joy and fruition, expressing in its spirit those words of joy, my glory will ever be renewed, and I shall multiply my days as a palm tree. I'd like to begin my conference with a brief overview of John's life, because his doctrine, like all of our saints, is born from his life experience and mystical experience. When we consider John's life, especially his early life, marked by poverty, illness, and death, a joyful and happy life seems absent. John was born in poverty. His father, Gonzalo de Yepes, died when he was about 3 years old. Gonzalo's premature death left his mother, Catalina, widowed and in a state of mendicity, to feed and clothe her 2 sons, Francisco and Juan. Luis, a younger brother, had died probably of malnutrition at a very young age. To provide for her sons, Catalina took them to Medina del Campo, an important market town in Spain and known for its charitable organizations. To provide for Juanito, the little John, Catalina enrolled him in a charitable organization called La Doctrina, which was an organization for poor and abandoned boys. Later on, Don Alonso de Alvarez de Toledo, a very rich, wealthy man who founded the Hospital of the Conception, known as Las Bubas, hired John as a nurse's aide and alms seeker for the hospital, which was established to care for patients suffering from contagious diseases, particularly syphilis, which was widespread at the time. Las bubas is like blisters. Blisters were on the groin caused by syphilis. That's why they called it las bubas. This experience taught John compassion and tenderness for those in extreme suffering. It taught him how precious life is and the suffering caused when human beings strive to find joy, happiness, and love in all the wrong places. Begging alms for the sick, poor was an unpleasant experience, as you can imagine, especially in a society where there was a great abyss between social classes. The higher society looked down on the poor, servants, and lower classes. A society where beggars roam the streets and at times even maim themselves in order to elicit pity from passersby. A text in the Ascent to Mount Carmel captures this experience. Now, this is a text from the Ascent to Mount Carmel, Book 3, which I will refer to later on in my conference. Joy and sweet fragrance foments disgust for the poor, which is contrary to Christ's doctrine, aversion for servants, submissiveness of heart in humble things, and spiritual insensitivity, at least in the measure of appetite. Joy in the delights of food directly engenders gluttony and drunkenness, anger, discord, and lack of charity towards one's neighbor and the poor, as toward Lazarus on the part of the rich man who ate sumptuously each day. Don Alonso not only recognized John's devotion to the poor and the sick, but also his intellectual capacity for study. He enrolled him in the Jesuit college, recently established in Medina del Campo, hoping perhaps that he might be ordained a priest and become a chaplain for the hospital. In addition to his care for the sick and begging for alms, John attended classes at the Jesuit school. He attended classes during the day and studied at night. And these years of caring for the sick, poor, and having to juggle classes and work during the day and study at night profoundly influenced his life. This gave him a compassionate heart and an understanding of human nature, the struggles of life, and the disorders of the heart that engender suffering. John felt called to the Carmelite order, and in February 1563, he entered the recently founded Carmelite monastery of Santa Ana and was given the name Fray Juan de San Matias, John of St. Matthias. He made his profession in 1554 and moved to the monastery of St. Andres in Salamanca, where he continued his studies in the monastery and at the University of Salamanca. He was ordained to the priesthood in Salamanca in 1567 and celebrated his first Mass in Medina del Campo. Shortly after his ordination, he passed through a vocational crisis and seriously considered transferring to the Carthusians. During a visit to Medina del Campo that same year, he met Teresa of Jesus, who was making her second foundation in Medina. He shared his Carthusian aspirations with her. Impressed by his sincerity and spiritual longings, she begged him to wait. She had recently founded a new style of Carmelite life in 1562 that mirrored the first hermits on Mount Carmel, a life of solitude, silence, unceasing prayer lived within community. She promised him a monastery where he could realize his aspirations for a more contemplative life and also ministry. On November the 28th, 1568, the first Sunday of Advent, he donned the new habit of the Discalced Carmelites in the new monastery of Durarello, a small hamlet not far from Avila, and he took the name John of the Cross. A major event took place in his life on the night of December the 2nd, 1577, while he was serving as confessor to the nuns of the Incarnation, where St. Teresa had been appointed as prioress. A group of Cal's friars broke into the hermitage where he was staying, blindfolded him, and took him on horseback to the Cal's monastery in Toledo. The superiors of the Cal's friars considered John a rebellious friar because of his involvement with Teresa's reform. He was imprisoned in the monastery cell of the Toledo monastery for 9 months. This was one of the darkest periods of his life. He was not allowed to say Mass or to receive visitors. 3 times a week he was taken to the refectory, where he was humiliated and publicly beaten to force him to renounce the reform. He bore the marks of those beatings for the rest of his life. This was not a joyful experience. Okay. John possessed great integrity, and he refused to abdicate before the superiors who tried to persuade him by offering him a position as a prior, a gold cross, and other worldly positions. John was a free man who refused to be seduced by positions of honor, prestige, and comfort. He was a man of one ideal, to love and serve God. What is amazing is that in the midst of such darkness, mistreatment, and deprivation, he composed some of the most beautiful lyrical poetry of the 16th century Spain. It was as though the deprivation emptied him out of all false securities, and a world of spiritual beauty and joy emerged from within him. Having asked for some paper and pen from one of his most benign jailers, he composed the spiritual canticle, the romances on the gospel, the song of the soul that rejoices to know God through faith. Rejoices, see, joy. These poems are full of metaphors of beauty and joy. O green meadows, coated bright with flowers. O spring-like crystal, resounding rivers, flowers and roses, perfume, swift-winged birds, water, gentle breeze, new wine, emeralds, sweet nightingale, and living beauty. These are all the images that we find in these poems. By August of 1578, he was so weak that he knew he had to escape. Then one night he escaped through a window and made his way to the convent of the Discalced Carmelite nuns. John's Toledo experience marked the beginning of a new stage in his life's journey. Following his escape, he was sent to the south of Spain, Andalusia, and the 10 years he lived there were the most active and fruitful of his Carmelite life. He was confessor to the Carmelite nuns, spiritual director of both religious and laity, founder of some monasteries, superior and vicar provincial. He wrote all his major works during the Andalusian period in the midst of his administrative duties. Scholars speculate that he traveled 27,000 kilometers in his life. John exuded a joyful spirit in community. For instance, John's early career as a nurse's aide and alms seeker for the sick profoundly shaped his religious life. And one of his favorite ministries in the community was to care for his sick brothers. He also visited the sick often in the villages. He used different therapies to cheer his sick brothers. He would tell them jokes, prepare a friar's favorite dish to increase his appetite. He also hired musicians to play for them. There's a lot. It's really interesting when you read the process of beatification, the testimonies of his care for the sick, and his therapies of hiring musicians and cheering people up, telling jokes and things of this nature. At Christmas, he sang and danced with the image of the child Jesus in his arms. He would sing as he traveled along the dusty Andalusian roads to his various ministries. John was not a sad or melancholic friar despite all that he went through. Witnesses who lived with him testified that he could not tolerate melancholic people around him. Another witness testified that he spoke peacefully and transmitted joy in the community. When he noticed that a friar was sad or depressed, he would spend time with him, and often he would take him to the garden to speak with him and to cheer him up. The friar would return happy and consoled. One of his principles of leadership that he used to tell other superiors was, try not to let your confreres leave your presence sad. Okay. In 1591, a persecution was launched against him because he stood against Father Doria's harsh treatment of Father Jerome Gratian, to whom Teresa had entrusted the success of the reform of the friars, as well as Father Doria's efforts to control the communal and spiritual life of the Carmelite nuns. As a result, Father Doria planned to exile him to Mexico. In 1591, his health began to fail. He was sent back to Andalusia to a small contemplative community called La Pañuela, where he gave himself up to prayer, working in the garden, and exercising his ministry as spiritual director. But all was not comfort and joy, as new trials awaited him. A certain friar, Juan Evangelista, a friar whom John had once corrected, held a bitter grudge against him. He set out to assuage his vindictive nature by doing all he could to destroy John's reputation. In September of 1591, John fell ill with a fever. He moved to the monastery in Ubara. The prior, Father Chrysostomo, also harbored a grudge against John and resented having this sick friar in his community. John accepted this mistreatment with patience and no complaint. An inflammation in his leg worsened and gangrene set in. Finally, on December the 13th, 1591, the end drew near. He prepared himself for death. At midnight, the bells rang for matins. He asked why they were ringing. When they told him they were ringing for matins, he said, "Glory be to God, for I shall say them in heaven." He kissed the crucifix and prayed, "Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." He breathed his last breath. He was 49 years old. A letter John wrote in response to a Carmelite nun in Segovia, distressed over the persecution against him, reveals the depth and health of his soul, as well as the source of joy, even in the midst of suffering. He wrote this: "Do not let what is happening to me, daughter, cause you any grief, for it does not cause me any. What greatly grieves me is that the one who is not at fault is blamed. Men do not do these things, but God, who knows what is suitable for us and arranges things for our good. Think nothing else but that God ordains all, and where there is no love, put love, and you will draw out love." These words are an eloquent testimony to John's life and spiritual health, responding in patience and love to every circumstance of life, good or bad, joyful or painful. Where there is no love, put love, and you will draw out love. John lived with a positive attitude toward life, embracing life as it is under God's conditions, with love and trust in God's providential care. When we reflect on John's life, we see poverty, suffering, struggle, misunderstanding, mistreatment, and a strong determination in the face of life's challenges. Where was the source of joy in his life? As I read John, I see joy. This is an interesting theme, trying to find out joy in John of the Cross. How would I present this? When I see joy in four key areas of his doctrine that I believe reflect his life experience. The first is the joy of life, God's love. The joy of life that comes from knowing God's love for us. When I think of John, I recall Jesus' words in the Gospel of John, as the Gospel of John. "As the Father has loved me, so I love you. Remain in my love. If you remain in my love, you will keep my commandments, just as I've kept my Father's commandments and remain in his love. I tell you this so that my joy may be in you and your joy complete." Jesus' farewell address to his disciples before his passion and death expresses the essence of true joy, the inexpressible love by which Jesus knew he was loved by his Father. The Father's love was the source of Jesus' life, and it filled his consciousness. At his baptism, he heard these words, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Later on, John said, reported in John's Gospel, "I and the Father are one. I can do nothing by myself." Jesus desires that we come to know and to share in that same inexpressible love that the Father has for him, to live in the love he shares with the Father. This is joy, to come to know the true and infinite love of God. Like Jesus, John of the Cross wants us to know God's love which surpasses all understanding. John understands the deepest longings of the human heart. Deep within our heart is an innate and insatiable longing to love and be loved. This yearning for love is the driving force that propels us toward God. This is true joy, not a joy of satisfied desire, but an unsatisfied desire, a deep longing for God. John provides the key to understanding this driving force within us. And I will quote from the Spiritual Canticle. "The soul's aim is a love equal to God's, for lovers cannot be satisfied without feeling that they love as much as they are loved. Whether we are conscious of it or not, deep in our hearts is an innate desire to love as God loves. Now, to love as God loves seems like an impossible dream and unimaginable. But God is the creator of this desire. Our thirst for love is so profound, compelling, and ardent that we never feel satisfied, even by those whom we love most and who love us unconditionally. This is the essence of joy, a longing for God that nothing in this world can ultimately satisfy. John of the Cross traces the origin of our desire for love back to the Trinity and God's purpose in creating human beings. In his poem, The Romances, John sings of God's loving plan to create human beings capable of knowing and loving God and participating in the very life of the Trinity. John has an incredibly positive image of God. He contemplates our God as the Trinity, as a family of love, a mystery of self-communicating love and goodness who shares life. And God's purpose in creating us is not simply because being God, God wills to create beings outside himself. Rather, God created us in order for us to enter into a communion of life with him, to draw us into God's family circle, into the Trinitarian life, which is a dynamic relationship of self-giving love. We were created out of love and for love, created in the image and likeness of God, created to give and receive love, to know and love God, to participate in an intimate friendship with God, other people, and all creation. For John of the Cross, our destiny to union with God through love is profoundly marked by the mystery of the incarnation of Jesus Christ. The incarnation of Jesus Christ not only restored humanity to our original nature, but gives us the possibility of realizing the fullness of life for which God predestined us from all eternity. In his apostolic letter on Christian joy, St. Pope Paul VI wrote, "In essence, Christian joy is the spiritual sharing in the unfathomable joy, both divine and human, which is in the heart of Jesus Christ glorified." In becoming human, God shared our existence down to the concrete realities of daily life, such as eating and drinking. Okay? And in becoming one of us in all things but sin, Jesus Christ lifts us to the Father, where God's joy will be our joy. God rejoices in us. We are God's joy, and our joy is God's joy. And this is one of the stanzas of the Romances. He would take her tenderly in his arms, and there give her his love. And when they were thus one, he would lift her to the Father, where God's very joy would be her joy. John also tells us that we live in the gaze of God's merciful love. That God's eyes of mercy descends upon us and imprints his love and grace within us and makes us beautiful. And I would invite you all to really read stanza 32 of the Spiritual Canticle. It really is one of the most beautiful stanzas. Okay. I'll read one part of the stanza here. When you looked at me, your eyes of mercy imprinted grace in me. For this you loved me ardently, and thus my eyes deserved to adore what they beheld in you. John tells us that God looked on this world with love and clothed the world in all the heavens with beauty and gladness. That comes from stanza 6 of the Spiritual Canticle. John writes something incredibly profound in stanza 32 of the Spiritual Canticle, when he speaks of God's merciful and loving gaze. And I want to read the text. I don't like to read a lot of text because, unfortunately, I don't have PowerPoint. I have to learn how to do this, okay? I'll call Michael Joseph down the corridor, okay? It should be noted for an understanding of this that just as God loves nothing outside himself, he bears no love for anything lower than the love he has for himself. He loves all things for himself. Thus, love becomes the purpose for which he loves. He therefore does not love things because of what they are in themselves. With God, to love the soul is to put her somehow in himself and make her his equal. Thus, he loves the soul within himself, with himself, that is, with the very love by which he loves himself. This is why the soul merits the love of God in all her works, insofar as she does them in God. God loves us within himself. Just think of that. We are like babies in the womb of our mother. We live in God's love as a baby is enveloped in the womb of his or her mother. God loves nothing outside himself. He loves us and ardently desires that we come to know ourselves as enveloped in his merciful and transforming love. The image and experience of God in John's mysticism is not of asceticism or mortification or the nada, but an experience of God as a nourishing father or mother who enfolds us, cares for us, nourishes us, heals us, and transforms us into divine life. And John writes in stanza 27 of the Spiritual Canticle, another very beautiful stanza to read. In this interior union, God communicates himself to the soul with such genuine love that neither the affection of a mother, with which she so tenderly caresses her child, nor a brother's love, nor any friendship is comparable to it. In other words, there is no friendship like God's friendship. There is no love of a brother like God's love. There is no motherly affection like God's affection who tenderly caresses her child. This last image is powerful because John is telling us that in the history of humanity, no mother has caressed her child like God caresses us. His tenderness is for everyone without limit. In Book 1 of the Dark Night, John presents God as a nourishing mother who nourishes us at his breast and weans us so that we will mature in the spiritual life. John had a very special relationship with his mother. They know that in his biography. He was very close to his mother. And in fact, his mother, in order to earn money, hired herself as a wet nurse. So he saw babies feeding from his mother's breast. And so I think this is why it comes out in the dark night. He said, it should be known that God nourishes and caresses a soul after it has been resolutely converted to his service, like a loving mother who warms her child with the heat of her bosom, nurses it with good milk and tender food, and carries and caresses it in her arms. But as the child grows older, the mother withholds her caresses and hides her tender love. She rubs bitter aloes on her sweet breast and sets the child down from her arms, letting it walk on its own feet, so that it may put aside the habits of childhood and grow accustomed to greater and more important things. The grace of God acts just as a loving mother by re-engendering in the soul new enthusiasm and fervor in the service of God. So before our tender and loving God, we have to allow ourselves, I think John tells us, to be loved like children who allow their mother and father to love them. Jesus tells us in Mark's Gospel, truly I tell you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter it. We have to allow ourselves to be loved. We have to allow God's merciful gaze to descend upon us and heal and transform us into the beauty of Christ. Another way I think to express this is we have to allow ourselves to be wounded by the beloved. And this is a theme that comes in the spiritual canticle of St. John of the Cross. In stanza 1 of the spiritual canticle, the bride is wounded by Christ the beloved. The wound is a wound of love. That is, she has come to know the beloved's love for her and that God created her solely for himself, that love is the purpose of her existence, and that life is short. Our journey to union begins with an awareness of God's love for us. We have to caer en la cuenta, as John says. We have to become aware of the gift of life, of God's love for us. We have to become aware that we are created solely for God and that we owe him every response of our love and that life is passing. It's very precious. This awareness awakens to us to authentic spiritual joy. God is the source of all meaning and joy. Further on in the stanza 1 of the spiritual canticle, John sings the beauty of the human person who is the dwelling place of God. He writes, There is reason for you to be elated and joyful in seeing that all your good and hope is so close as to be within you. It brings great happiness to a person to understand that God is never absent, not even from a soul in mortal sin, and how much less from one in the state of grace. What more do you want, O soul? What else do you search for outside when within yourself you possess your riches, delights, satisfaction, fullness, and kingdom, your beloved whom you desire and seek? Be joyful and gladdened in your interior recollection with him, for you have him so close to you. At the end of John's prayer of the soul taken in love, the soul realizes that God, her beloved, has given her all that God has given her. And she prays with such joyful gratitude. Mine are the heavens and mine is the earth. Mine are the nations, the just are mine, and mine the sinners. The angels are mine, and the mother of God, and all things are mine. And God himself is mine and for me, because God is mine and all for me. What do you ask then and seek, my soul? Yours is all this, and all is for you. Do not engage yourself in something less or pay heed to the crumbs that fall from your Father's table. Go forth and exalt in your glory. Hide yourself in it and rejoice, and you will obtain the supplications of your heart. At this point, I ask you, do we get up every morning in gratitude for the gift of our life, created out of love and for love? Gratitude for God's enveloping presence in our life. I think that Sister's presentation yesterday, was a very beautiful presentation on the presence of God as well. See, which is very much deep in our tradition, well, in the old Christian tradition, but especially in our saints. We live in God's love like a baby in the womb of his or her mother. We have to recall each day the gracious and free gift of life. This can become a powerful emotion to reflect on and bring us joy. True joy arises from an ever-deepening consciousness that we are enveloped in God's loving grace, that our human destiny is to share in the fullness of God's life and to radiate God's love in this world. As John writes in stanza 29 of the Spiritual Canticle, something so simple but so profound. After all, this love is the end for which we were created. Life is precious. Every day is a day to grow in deeper awareness of God's enveloping presence and God's dream for us. Especially in moments of suffering, trial, and darkness, we can recall the enveloping love of God and all that God has given us. The more we can cultivate gratitude for the gift of life, even in the midst of suffering and difficulties, and allow God's loving gaze to transform us through a life of prayer, the sacraments, and the love that we give and receive from each other, the more joy we will experience. We must remember that God's love flows through us to one another through the incarnation, and that's through each other. There is no joy like experiencing the love of another person. Transformation, which is the heart of the doctrine of John and Teresa, begins now in this life by allowing ourselves to be gazed upon by God's merciful love and to strive to maintain a positive attitude in daily life. The more we are transformed by God's self-communicating love, the more we rejoice. As John writes in 36 of the Canticle, let us rejoice, beloved, and let us go forth to behold ourselves in your beauty, to the mountain and to the hill, to where the pure water flows, and further deep into the thicket. The second key of John's mysticism is the dark night as a positive experience, an act of God's mercy, a grace and a path of healing and restoration that opens us to authentic spiritual joy. One of the main problems of life is that due to the effects of original sin and personal sin, along with our various characters and temperaments, we tend to seek our happiness, joy, and satisfaction of heart from the outside in material values, possessions, pleasures, sex, honors, prestige, codependent relationships, rather than inward in God, who is the ultimate source of all love, happiness, and joy. One dark night, fired with love's urgent longings, all the sheer grace. I went out unseen, my house now all stilled. Oh, that glad night, in secret, for no one saw me, nor did I look at anything with no other light or guide than the one that burned in my heart. In la noche dichosa, the happy night, even though the dark night is described as bitter, terrible, and horrendous in some of John's descriptions, the dark night is a graced experience. It is a process of healing, transformation, becoming free from our dysfunctional and selfish way of loving, our fears, our wounds, our addictions, our attachments. It's also a lovable and happy night, a sheer grace. The darkness and humiliation that we may experience in the dark night does not proceed from God. God is all light and love. He only knows how to love. Contemplation is the loving inflow of God within us that enlightens us, purges us of our habitual ignorances and imperfections, and instructs us in the perfection of love. John writes in The Dark Night, it remains to be said, then, that even though this happy night darkens the spirit, it does so only to impart light concerning all things. And even though it humbles individuals and reveals their miseries, it does so only to exalt them. And even though it impoverishes and empties them of all possessions and natural affection, it does so only that they may reach out divinely to the enjoyment of all earthly and heavenly things with a general freedom of spirit in them all. So the darkness, the humiliation, and emptiness we may experience arises from ourselves. When God's light envelops us, it reveals all that is hard, wounded, and dysfunctional within us. The fire of God's love smokes out, let's put it that way, all our limitations, our selfishness, our violence, and all our disordered attachments. John says that very, very beautifully in the living flame of love. He said, when the light is very excessive, and when it penetrates our life, it reveals all that's dark, all that's contrary to love, all that's contrary to God. The pain we experience in this purifying process does not come from God, but from us. John writes, there is nothing in contemplation or the divine inflow that of itself can give pain. Contemplation bestows rather sweetness and delight. The pain comes from our own shadow side and deeply ingrained selfish patterns of behavior. In Book 1 of the Ascent of Mount Carmel, John describes the kinds of suffering our selfish and dysfunctional way of relating to life causes us and robs us of spiritual joy. Not only do they deprive us of God's Spirit, but they cause all kinds of suffering. They weary, torment, darken, defile, and weaken us. Of course, we can't go into an explanation of all these. Just very, very briefly, he said this is the suffering that's caused by our disordered way of loving. It is important for us to remember that the dark night is an incarnational experience. The dark night does not take place in some clinic, and then we return healthy and happy. It takes place in the realities of daily life. Dryness in prayer, temptations, a failure, a conflictual relationship that reveals our selfishness, an illness, all those experiences of life that unmask our radical poverty and need for God. These experiences make us realize that where true happiness and joy reside in God. They detach us from our strong conditioning to seek ultimate happiness and satisfactions in things other than God. And if embraced with faith, hope, and love, the dark night frees us from what prevents us from experiencing true joy in God. God desires our freedom from suffering, and God knows that without the light of the Holy Spirit, healing is impossible. We are radically dependent upon God's saving grace. The dark night, therefore, is an act of God's mercy. It is a positive experience. It's a path of healing and transformation to create the birth of true joy. The third key to joy in the experience and mysticism of St. John of the Cross is his teaching on the purification of the will in Book 3 of the Ascent of Mount Carmel, where he specifically treats of the emotion of joy. He says the passions. I'm going to translate the passion as emotions. Because I think in psychological language today, it's more emotion than passion, how we would understand it. Even though John planned to treat the other emotions such as hope, fear, and sorrow, he focuses on joy. John describes joy as the delight we experience in an object we esteem and consider fulfilling. However, there is a vain joy, which I would translate as selfish or narcissistic joy. As we have seen, for John, love is the source and reason for our existence. And that God's original plan in creating us is that we would redirect our whole being, our intellect, our memory, our will, all of our energies, our affections, everything completely to God. This was he says God's original plan in creation. We'd be totally directed towards God. In directing our whole lives to God, we will fulfill the great commandment of love. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's what that means, being wholly directed to God and living the great commandment of love. Our whole being is meant to be directed towards loving God and neighbor. However, we know from experience that love is not a simple energy that conforms to the gospel simply because we wish it. How marvelous it would be if love was an energy that easily empowered us to conform our will to the loving service of God and neighbor. Life would be much more easier, wouldn't it? Okay. Growing in love is a lifelong process. We need a formation in love. As William Blake wrote, we are put on earth a short space to learn how to bear the beams of love. For John of the Cross, growing in love requires an ongoing and deepening formation and strengthening of our capacity and desire to love. That's why I would highly recommend for you to read Book 3, The Ascent of Mount Carmel, chapters 16 to 45. It's rather long, it's very detailed, but it's very, very rich in doctrine, and it reflects very much Book 1 of The Ascent of Mount Carmel. Anyway, in that book, Book 3, John writes about the purification of the will. In other words, John wants to form us in learning to love according to the gospel. And he tells us that we should rejoice only in what is for the honor and glory of God. And the greatest honor we can give him is to serve him with evangelical perfection, to love him above all things, and to love all things in him. And John provides 6 categories of goods in which we can actively rejoice. Temporal goods, natural goods, sensory, moral, supernatural, and spiritual. We can divide these categories into 2 major groups. I don't want to get too detailed here, but just kind of briefly, there's the groups, goods of the earth and spiritual goods. Okay. Under the goods of the earth, temporal goods, riches, status, positions, places of prestige, even relatives and marriage. Natural goods, beauty, grace, elegance, bodily constitution, good intelligence, discretion, other talents. Sensory goods, what with the senses, sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch, discursive imagination. Under spiritual goods, where we can place our joy. These are all goods where we can place our joy. Virtues, the exercise of virtues, the practice of the works of mercy, observance of God's will, the practice of good manners. Supernatural goods, these are goods where we can place our joy. Gifts of wisdom and knowledge, the grace of healing, working of miracles, prophecy, discernment of spirits, the gift of tongues, all these things that St. Paul talks about. They're supernatural goods where we can place our joy. And the spiritual goods, they're goods they're motivating, they turn us towards communion with God. They're God's communication, spiritual experiences. If we look at all those goods, and if you read them in the Ascent of Mount Carmel, we see that the list of categories that John establishes, a wide range of goods that covers every dimension of human existence, where we place our affectivity, from earthly goods to spiritual goods. And the reason for this is that John is concerned about the totality of our person, of human existence. He excludes nothing from the field of human existence. All of our being is to be ordered toward God. that no human activity or object or affection is excluded from the love of God. Now, he's not saying that things are bad. He never says that. The problem is not created things. The problem is in here, okay, in the way we relate to life. We're called to love God and everything else in God, and not to love anything outside of God. That is, taking it out of God, at the horizon of God. Everything exists in God. Every person or reality deserves our love in light of God, if we see it in the light of God. Okay. It's a great reverence for everything in life in the light of God. It's when we separate those goods from God that we get into trouble. John excludes nothing from the horizon of God's love. His concern is not with goods or created things, objects. Rather, his concern is the quality of our love. How do we love? Selfishly or freely? Okay, for the love of God. Much like John's treatment in the disordered appetites in Book 1 of the Sin of Mount Carmel, he describes the harm that comes to people when they direct their emotion of joy in objects other than in God. In other words, they direct their joy in a way which they're not doing it for the honor and glory of God, but they're doing it for selfish reasons. Then he explains the benefits that we experience from not rejoicing in objects or goods other than God. I'm going to give you some examples, just two. There's a lot of them. He gives some examples of the harm that comes to people when they try to find their ultimate emotional fulfillment in temporal goods, such as riches, status, and prestige. He said that people can become, when they become so attached to these things, they can become so obsessed with money or temporal goods that they become greedy and selfish, and they forget God and their neighbor. They make a God for themselves out of money and temporal goods. Instead of directing their joy to God, who alone can satisfy them, they become so attached to these goods and obsessed with them that oftentimes they fall into despair and even commit suicide. Now, isn't that true? Yeah, he's got a lot of wisdom there. You read it in the paper. You know people who commit suicide because they didn't have, because or riches or money or whatever it is. They're. On the other hand, he said the benefit that comes from ordering our love and joy in God and temporal goods is freedom of heart to love and serve God, charity towards our neighbor, and compassion for the poor. Then he gives examples of moral goods in which we can place our joy. Not only material, but moral goods, like the virtue, the practice of works of mercy, and observance of God's law. What's our motivation for virtue in all those things? However, if we practice virtue and works of mercy for praise or some other motivation rather than purely for the love of God, we will also experience harm, such as pride, vainglory, judging other people to be evil and imperfect, supposing that the deeds of others are not as good as ours. Or we play the Pharisee, I'm better than John or Mary, okay? Gossiping and criticizing others. We will not find our reward with God if we perform our good works solely out of pleasing other people, okay? The benefit, however, when we perform our acts of virtue and deeds of mercy for the honor and glory of God, and not for selfish motivation, we are free from deceit and become meek and humble. There is inner peace and true joy because we perform our actions for the honor and glory of God. We do them for the love of Jesus Christ, not for vanity. Therefore, John tells us that whatever we do it for the love of God by raising our joy to God rather than focusing on selfish pleasure apart from God, doing it purely for God, not for just self. Now that's a whole formation of life, okay? This is what he's teaching us. John tells us that there is nothing worthy of a person's joy save the service of God and the procurement of his honor and glory in all things. One should seek this alone in use of things, turning away from vanity and concern for one's own delight and consolation. Okay. In other words, John goes really into the motivation of why we do what we do and why we love the way we love, why we relate to things the way we relate to them. John's fundamental theory is that selfish love leads to disintegration and dispersion, whereas love of God unifies, and brings us interior harmony and peace. He believes that our spiritual life and emotional life depend upon where do we center our strength? Where do we find our joy? In God or in objects other than God? And that when we center our energy on God, it brings us peace and harmony. John's teaching is an important and profound one if we wish to grow in love, which is the source of evangelical joy. He offers us a formation of love, a path of strengthening our will so that we will know true love and happiness that comes from a life lived in love. Evangelical joy arises from enjoying all the goods in this world in the light of God's honor and glory, to view all things in the light of God, and lifting our joy in all things to God in love. His teaching implies a constant examination in our daily life. Where do I place my joy? Do I strive to do all for the honor and glory of God? Where do I find my deepest emotional fulfillment? In God or things other than God? For whom am I living? For God or self? John's doctrine here, even though it's very, I would say, this whole book 3 of the Ascent on the Purification of the Will, is really quite simple in the bottom line. Spiritual joy comes from doing everything for the honor and glory of God, seeking all things in the light of God's loving presence. The fourth key to joy in John's doctrine is learning to be positive and content in the frustrations and difficulties of daily life. In the Ascent of Mount Carmel, John has a series of maxims to help us bring harmony and peace to our, talks about the passions, the emotions again, joy, hope, fear, and sorrow. He includes joy here. This is his maxims. Endeavor to be always inclined, not to the easiest, but to the most difficult. Not to the most delightful, but to the most distasteful. Not to the most gratifying, but to the less pleasant. Not to what means rest for you, but to hard work. Not to the consoling, but to the unconsoling. Not to the most, but to the least. Not to the highest and most precious, but to the lowest and most despised. Not to wanting something, but to wanting nothing. Do not go about looking for the best of temporal things, but for the worst, and for Christ, desire to enter complete nakedness, emptiness, and poverty in everything in the world. Now, that doesn't want to make you laugh, does it? Okay. That's not what you think is joyful. But actually, it's very, very positive. Let me explain it. It's easy to misinterpret this teaching. He's not telling us that we must seek only the most difficult, the most distasteful, the less pleasant, to what's hard work, unconsoling, and to the most despised. I mean, you wouldn't want to invite him to a party. If that's what he believed. Okay. No. He's not teaching an asceticism for the sake of asceticism or suffering for the sake of suffering. He's reminding us that life is made up of all kinds of experiences. There are sunny days and rainy days, good days, bad days, delightful experiences and distasteful ones, days of rest and hard work. Some days we wake up energetic, and other days it's hard to put one foot ahead in front of the other. Whatever our experience or task before us, positive or negative, consoling or unconsoling, accept it and embrace it with a positive attitude and do it for love. That's what he's saying. John wants us to balance our tendency to seek only that which gives us delight, ease, and consolation, and to push away what's difficult and distasteful and hard work. Because we tend to do that, cling to only what's easy and all that, and push away what we don't like. We do that with people as well, don't we? Okay, definitely with people, okay, unfortunately. He wants us to embrace every experience of life with a positive attitude. No pasa nada. It's okay. This is the day I'm going to do the best I can. This is the way life is. If we can embrace every experience of life with a positive attitude and do it out of the love of God, we will find a deeper joy and balance in our life. Joy does not mean the absence of suffering or frustrations. Our lives are like a tapestry intertwined with days of joy and suffering, delight and distaste, easy and difficult. This is part of life. John's life was not easy. He had many frustrations and trials, but he embraced everything with a positive and loving attitude. We see this at the end of his life when he wrote, "Men do not do these things but God, who knows what is suitable for us and arranges things for our good. Think nothing that God ordains all. Where there is no love, put love, and you will draw out love." Even at the end of his life, in persecution, illness, and dying in a monastery where the prior had held a grudge against him, he saw the events of life with the eyes of faith, hope, and love. He put love where there was no love, and he drew out love. And this is the secret of joy for St. John of the Cross.